She was walking towards the wooden figure in the corner, the marble floor cold under her bare feet, the torches casting long shadows across it. Her hands were trembling. 7 silent witnesses were standing behind her, their faces outlined by the lamps, their eyes following each of her movements. They had told her it was tradition, that every bride before her had done so, that refusing would shame her family, but none had told her what that tradition was. Not until that moment, not until the cloth was removed and she saw what lay underneath. It was the year 89-8, living under Emperor Domitian. At 18 years of age, Flavia had come to realize that a Roman marriage had absolutely nothing to do with the saffron-colored veils and the nuts which were thrown around during the public ceremony. The quiet, behind-the-scenes encounter in the presence of onlookers who could later serve as court witnesses if needed was something entirely different. Something which even Roman historians struggled to describe, something which the Christian Church would take centuries to erase from memory. The wedding procession was beautiful in its own way. Flavia had worn the traditional flame-colored veil that marked a bride. Her hair was arranged in 6 braids tied with wool ribbons, exactly as custom dictated. The sacrifice at the temple went smoothly. The sheep's entrails showed favorable omens. Her father had signed the contracts, transferring her from his authority to that of her husband, using the ancient formula that made the union legally binding under Roman law. She had spoken the ritual words generations of brides had said before her, ubi te Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The phrase meant she was no longer herself. She now belonged to her husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than she was, whom she had met exactly 3 times before that day. But that had been only the legal beginning. What waited for her at the end of the torchlit procession through Rome, inside the house she had never entered? In the room where the witnesses were already gathered was where the real transformation would take place. That was where she would discover what Roman law truly demanded of a wife's body. Obscene songs were sung by the crowd around the procession, as required by tradition. The Fescennine verses were explicit and vulgar in the description of what was to be done with her that night in raw detail. Young men yelled suggestions that made her face burn beneath the veil. Her mother had explained it was a way of sending away evil spirits by laughter and embarrassment. But Flavia saw her mother didn't smile. She'd cried when she braided her daughter's hair that morning, and her last words were a nervous whisper, "Do not resist. Whatever they ask of you, do not resist it, only makes everything worse." They reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus by the time the sun had completely set. The entrance was garlanded with wool and green leaves. 2 torches signified that here a lawful marriage was to be consummated. The crowd grows boisterous, the songs louder. Someone tosses nuts at her. The shells get caught up in her dresser propitiatory act, a fertility charm. But to her, mockery. Her husband was waiting at the threshold, and beyond him she saw figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures, far too many for a private moment between bride and groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold. Tradition said it was bad luck for a bride to stumble when entering her new home. It also symbolized something older in age, when women were carried into their husband's house whether they wanted to go or not. The door shut behind her, silencing the singing outside. And finally, Flavia saw what was awaiting her in the atrium. The pronuba was an older woman, dressed formally. Her job was to supervise all that would occur that evening. A priest of questionable affiliation. 3 slave girls appear, carrying basins and clothes. Older man with leather case full of medical instruments, and in one corner a form under a rubbing shroud of cloth, approximately 1.2 meters in height. In wood, the pronuber stepped forward and took Flavia's hands in a firm, almost restraining grasp, as though expecting her to run. "Welcome to your husband's house," she said. "The sacred rites must now be completed. Here is what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was not primarily a romantic union, it was a transfer of property, documented and witnessed like the sale of a farm or a ship. Roman law classified marriage as conventio, in menome literally, coming into the hand, meaning a woman passed from her father's ownership to her husband's. In earlier centuries, this transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal power over his wife as over his slaves, including, theoretically, the right of life and death. By the imperial era, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the law had softened slightly. Women could own property. Divorce was possible. However, the basic principle remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another, and like every significant transfer of property in Rome, this needed confirmation. Just as land was inspected to confirm the seller's claims, a bride's body was inspected. Her fertility assessed because the first value of a Roman wife was her capacity to bear legitimate heirs. A marriage was not valid until it was consummated, and consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses. The bride's virginity had to be verified. Every demand begets a corresponding rituals, which made perfect sense within Roman legal logic, and horrify us precisely because that logic is now alien. The pronuber guided Flavia toward the figure underneath. The loud beating of her heart seemed to reach her ears. The pronuber's hand did not leave her arm, guiding firmly and allowing no retreat. "You must greet Mutinus Tutunus," the pronuber said. "You must ask him for his blessing before your husband approaches you. You must offer yourself as tradition demands." Flavia pulled away the cloth with trembling hands. Underneath was a wooden figure carved with anatomical precision into the form of a phallus. But it was not a small amulet worn by children for protection. It was not a harmless garden charm. It was deliberately sized, carefully proportioned for a specific purpose that became terribly clear as the pronuber explained what Flavia was required to do. Mutinus Tutunus was the Roman god of fertility and sexual initiation. Ancient sources mention him briefly, always with discomfort. Saint Augustine, in the 5th century, wrote with disgust that Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutunus as a sacred duty before consummation. His account matches earlier pagan sources. Arnobius described brides being forced to ride the emblem of the god while their husbands watched. Varro referred to the practice with language implying physical contact, though he avoided explicit details. Modern historians often minimize the ritual, offering symbolic contact, but the ancient words use dinsedir, to sit upon, to mount, and descriptions implying penetration do not support gentle interpretations. The purpose was divine blessing, but the practical effect was preparation to break resistance, to show submissiveness in the presence of witnesses, to prepare a virgin bride for what was to come. Flavia stood before the figure. The pronuber positioned her, instructed her, guided her body. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited for the examination to follow, and Flavia finally understood the meaning of her mother's tears. She could refuse, theoretically, but refusal meant dishonor, annulment. Returning home as damaged goods no respectable man would marry. It meant everything she had been taught about duty and honor was a lie. She did not refuse. After the ritual, the slave girls washed her in perfumed water. The washing was both religious purification and practical preparation for the medical examination. The physician approached silent until now. The examination was not optional. Respectable brides from significant families were inspected to verify virginity. The findings were documented as part of the legal record establishing her value. Now, the physician, following the ritual with mutinous tetanus, again performed an examination that confirmed the ritual was complete, that she exhibited symptoms as anticipated, and that she was now ready for consummation. All this in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might well be needed should the marriage be disputed. What surprises modern readers is not just the invasiveness, but the casualness. Romans did not regard these rites as traumatic. They were just necessary procedures for an important legal transaction. The bride's emotions were as irrelevant as the emotions of a field being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to procedure. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedroom, prepared for consummation. The bed was placed in clear view of the door, which would remain open all night. Oil lamps gave enough light for the pronuba to observe from her position near the entrance. The slave girls waited in the corridor. Marcus entered. He looked nervous, something that surprised Flavia. She had expected confidence, authority. Instead, he glanced at the pronuba with embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke in a formal tone. "The bride is ready. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated according to the laws of Rome and the customs of the ancestors. Let the witnesses confirm completion." What happened next lasted for hours. The pronuba watched, guiding when necessary, making sure consummation took place in such a manner as to satisfy the legal formalities. The door was left open. The noises echoed into the passageway. Everything that went on was semi-public confirmation ceremony, making certain no aspect of the transference of property could be questioned. At first light, the doctor arrived again in order to make a final check. He certified in writing that the consummation had occurred, reporting the physical changes that now distinguished virgin from wife. The pronuba gave legal witness. Legally, the transformation was now complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would bear 4 children in the next 10 years, run her husband's household, attend festivals, fulfill all duties of a matronand, never speak of her wedding night, not even to her daughters when their marriages were arranged. Because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was the way things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Roman women did not write of their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed. The rites were so deeply ingrained that describing them seemed unnecessary. Everyone knew, no one spoke. That is why reconstructing such practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian writers, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that makes sense only once the rituals are understood. It was not a conspiracy of silence. It was rather how deeply these traditions were ingrained in Roman life. They constituted the water Roman women swam in invisible, since it is so ubiquitous. For 1,000 years, this is what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women lived their wedding nights within this system, understood their experiences through this lens, and whispered warnings to their daughters. It persisted because all parties accepted its underlying assumptions. Property must be checked. Transfers shall be witnessed. Marriage is an institution that creates legal obligations and thus requires documentation. Women are the means of continuing families. Internally logical, externally monstrous. Its end did not come from Roman reform, but from religious conquest. Christianity brought fundamentally different assumptions. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property. If marriage was sacred, it could not include rituals the church found obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and examinations was offensive. Over centuries, the old customs were suppressed. Statues of Mutinous, Tutunus were smashed. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed or allowed to rot. Murals were painted over. The role of the pronuber was reduced to a ceremonial helper within a few generations. Detailed knowledge of Roman marriage rituals vanished for all but scholars studying surviving fragments. The Christians who transformed Rome were not just airbrushing an embarrassing heritage. They were constructing a new civilization on top of Roman ones, but hermetically sealing what was actually inside. They did their work so well that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really entailed. The comfortable myth of the saffron veil and nuts flung before bystanders replaced the uncomfortable reality. But the fragments survive. They always do. Flavia died in the year 131 AD at about 60 years old. She had been a wife for over 40 years. What did she think of her wedding night across those decades? Did she remember it as trauma, acceptance, something in between? Did she wish something different for her daughters, or did she simply accept that this was the way things were? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence surrounding these practices is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worthy of record, whose feelings about their own bodies were irrelevant to the histories and legal texts written by men. We do know what was done to them. We do not know what they made of it. But we know enough to understand why this story was buried, because it reveals something uncomfortable about the civilization we have inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law and culture. Recognizing what Rome truly did to its women complicates that legacy. It shows that civilization and brutality can coexist, that legal sophistication can stand alongside systematic dehumanization. The rites of the Roman wedding night have vanished, but the women who endured them were real. For Flavia Tessia, for her mother, for her daughters, and for the countless generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of verification and control. They lived, suffered through, and were silenced.